This lecture is part of my Godot beginners course. If you want to see the full course, check the link in the description. Hi everyone, in this lecture we're going to create the explosion effects. In the end, we're going to have an effect that plays when the enemy or the player dies. Let's take a look at it. Once I kill an enemy, this effect is being spawned, and it's the same for me. If I die, an explosion effect is emitted. Great, so let's take a look at how we can build this. Okay, so this is going to have two parts. The first part is going to be creating the explosion effect, and the second part is going to be using this effect inside of the game. So first of all, let's create a new scene. Yes, this is going to be a scene, and the root node is going to be a particles 2D. Let's rename this to explosion, and let's save this inside a new folder that we're going to call effects. So, just like we did for the previous two particle effects, we need to create a process material, and this will create the particle effect. Inside of here, we're gonna configure it in order to create an explosion effect. So right off the bat, let's set the scale to be 5, because 1 is just too small. We don't want the gravity to have any effects, so I'm gonna set that to 0. And we need some initial velocity, so let's set that to be 125. So right now my direction is set to 1 on the x, that's why the particles are going to the right, and that's fine, but I want my spread to be 180 because I want my particles to go in all the different directions. Let's turn down the time to be 0.5 because I want this effect to be very sudden. I don't want the particles on the screen too long. And this is the main difference between the menu effects that we created and this one. We don't want this effect to be emitted constantly. We want it to start and we want it to end right away. And to do that, we can use this one-shot property here. So if this is on, when I click on emitting here, it will start and it will stop after the lifetime of all the particles. In this case, we have 8. Great, so let's increase the amount to be 100 because 8 is not nearly enough. And let's see what it looks like. And now I'm going to use this emitting option here to test. So it's looking a bit better, but as you can see, the color is just not right. So let's set the color to be, well, first of all, we want it to be a gradient instead of a solid color. So let's set it to a new gradient. And this gradient will start off as a red, but a little bit orangish. And it's gonna end up being completely transparent, and it's going to be a little bit yellow. That's what we want. So let's see what this looks like. As you can see, it starts off as red and it ends up being completely transparent. And let's actually make it a little bit more red at the start. Okay, that's looking good. And just like this, it seems enough, but let's tweak this a little bit more. So right now, all of the particles have the same velocity. So let's set our velocity random to be 0.5 so that they have a little bit of variation between the particles. So now, as you can see, they don't all go at the same speed. And just like that, let's also set some damping. And damping is very simple. It's the rate at which particles lose velocity. So right now they don't ever lose velocity and they always keep going at 125, but we can set the damping to something like 100, which is the max, and that's going to make sure the particles lose velocity. So let's see what this looks like, and you can see that they go much less distance right now. And let's also make this a little bit random so that it looks more realistic. And this is basically what the explosion particle effect will look like. You can play around more if you want to, and you can maybe create a different kind of explosion for your game, but I'm gonna go with this one. And I'm also gonna add an audio stream player to this explosion because I want to play a sound. I'm gonna call this SFX, and I'm gonna use this explode.wave file I have. So we don't want this to autoplay because we're actually gonna create a script, and inside of the script we're gonna create a function called start, and inside of start we'll call sfx.play, and we're also gonna set the emitting property to true. So emitting is what I was using earlier to test my particle effect, and if this is set to true, the particles basically start playing, and inside of the start method here I'm gonna set it to true. So when the scene is run, as you can see, no particles are being played, but if I call the start method from the ready, you can see that the particles got played and the sound effect was also played. So let's get rid of this. We're not going to call it from here. We're actually going to do that from the world script. So this was basically the part one, the creation of the explosion effect. Now let's go to the world scene and let's use this. So what we can do, instead of creating a new explosion effect every time an enemy dies, we can instance it just once to the world scene. I have it here, and we can use it over and over again. And because it's set to one shot, it's not going to be visible until I call that start method from the explosion script. So, for example, if the player dies, I can just reposition this explosion node here from the world scene to here onto where the player was, and I can just call it start method so that I can play an explosion here. And I can do this again and again for enemies and for the player. So let's reset the position of the explosion, and let's actually create a new node here, a node 2D. Let's call this effects layer, and let's add the explosion to this. So in the future, if you want to add more effects, you can gather all of them under this node. Okay, great, we have the explosion. So let's get a reference to it from our world script. And now we can basically use it from the world script. So there are two places I want to create an explosion. When an enemy dies, which is here, or when the player dies, which is here. But currently, I don't know where the player died, or I don't know where an enemy died. I need to pass those positions from the enemy scripts and from the player script in order to use them from the world script. So let's go inside the enemy scene. And in here we have the enemy died signal. And currently we're passing the score. We can also pass the position or the location of this enemy as well. So when we're emitting this signal, let's also pass the global position of this enemy. So if I go back to the world script, when the enemy dies, I now have a location being passed to me. And now I can use this location to create a new explosion, which we can do by setting the explosion effect's global position to the location and calling the start method of the explosion effect. Let's try and see if this works. So when I kill an enemy, the explosion is being repositioned to its location and the start method is being called so that the particles start emitting and the sound effect also starts playing. That's great, but let's also do the same for the player. We need to go inside the player's scene, and from here we have the player died signal. So let's just pass the position of the player to this signal, which I'm going to call location. Remember, this is just an arbitrary name here that I decided to call my variable. But inside here, when the player dies, inside the take damage method, when the HP goes below 0, we need to pass the global position, which is a variable that is built in to the player class. Great, right now we're passing the position to the player died signal, so let's go back to the world script, and in here, inside this method that is connected to that signal, we can receive that location and we can use it to create a new explosion. So let's do that before we call yield so that we don't need to wait. And we need to use this same exact line, so let's actually turn this into its own method. I'm going to call that create explosion. And this will take in the location. So let's create a new method. And let's use this inside the player died method, using the location of the player. And I'm actually going to take this yield statement here with the timer, and I'm going to move it inside the game over method here after the enemy spawner stops. Okay, let's try this. And if all goes well, when the player dies, we should see an explosion effect. Great. Let's try that again. And when the enemy dies, we see an explosion. And when the player dies, we also see an explosion. And we also see the game over menu, which is just great. Awesome, so that was creating the explosion effect and using it inside the world scene. I hope that was useful. Thank you for watching, and let's get to the next one.